The ballroom at Aldeborn House was not the kind of room one entered without preparation. Its ceilings were painted with allegories of summer, its chandeliers were hung with 240 candles each, and the floor had been waxed to a brightness that doubled every gown, every jewel, every carefully arranged face in the room below it. Ladies had rehearsed their entrances for weeks. Mothers had planned for months. The season's machinery had been wound and set, and tonight it ran Thomasina Voss. Did not enter. She arrived at the edge. She came in through the side passage, behind Lady Darvel's chair, carrying the older woman's shawl and her fan in the small velvet reticule that held her salts, and she arranged herself 3 steps behind and to the left, which was the position a companion occupied in rooms like this one. Near enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. She had held that position for 2 years since her father's death had left her with £40, a trunk of books and no other prospects, and she had learned to wear invisibility the way one wears a second skin, with a kind of careful stillness that made certain no one looked twice. She had almost made it through the doorway when the Duke of Aldeborn turned his head. He was standing at the far edge of the room, near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, and the candlelight found the planes of his face with an unkind precision. 34 years old, and carrying every one of them in the set of his jaw. Sand and he was not watching the room the way the other men watched it, with that particular mixture of calculation and ennui that the season produced in its male participants. He was simply present, in the way a stone wall is present, and the crowd arranged itself at a slight distance from him without seeming to notice it was doing so. He looked at her for the space of one breath. Then his gaze moved on, and the orchestra began the opening measures of the first set, and Lady Darvel said, "My shawl, Thea. I am quite cold." And the moment was gone. Thea did not know what to make of it. She folded the shawl around Lady Darvel's shoulders, and decided she had made it up entirely. She had been making things up for 2 years. Small, careful fictions, the kind the mind manufactures when it needs something to look forward to through the long hours of adjusting footstools and transcribing correspondence, and listening to the complaints of a woman whose kindness was real, but whose demands were exhausting. She had learned not to trust the fictions, she told herself as the evening progressed, and she stood at the edge of the room in her plain gray gown among all those silks and satins, that the Duke of Aldeborn looked at everyone exactly that way, with that flat, measuring attention, and that it meant precisely nothing. She told herself this convincingly. She almost believed it. Lady Darvel was the Dowager Countess of Darvel, a widow of 63, whose health had been declining for 2 years, in a slow, patient way that no physician had successfully interrupted. She was not unkind. She paid Thea's £38 annually without complaint, permitted her access to the house's library, and occasionally remembered that Thea was a person and not a function. On the days she remembered, she was even affectionate. Thea had learned to value those days greatly, because they were the only warmth she could reliably expect. Her son, Mr. Frederick Darvel, she had learned to avoid entirely. He was 31 years old, possessed of his mother's house in Cavendish Square and a quarterly allowance that did not appear to cover his habits, and he had recently acquired a tendency to conduct his private business in the study adjacent to the drawing room in which Thea most often worked. He was not subtle, he was not careful, and 3 weeks into the season, Thea had found a letter. It was lying on the escritoire in Lady Darvel's sitting room, which was where it had no right to be, having been addressed to a Mr. Parpra. Clarence Bowen of Temple Lane. Thea had lifted it to set it aside, and the name Bowen had caught in her memory like a snag of thread because she had heard it before. In a conversation Frederick had not known she was near enough to overhear. Bowen was a moneylender. The letter, which was unsealed, described in precise terms a plan to represent a £400 sum as the proceeds of a legitimate sale of Lady Darvel's Hertfordshire property, a property that had in fact been sold for considerably less, and whose remaining proceeds had gone entirely to Frederick's creditors. The letter would have made Lady Darvel's son a ruined man if it reached anyone who could read it, and understood what they were reading. It would have made Lady Darvell a grieving one. Thea sat with it for a very long time. The practical course was clear. She could set the letter aside on the salver, where misdirected post was left for the housekeeper. Tell herself she had not read it thoroughly enough to form any opinion about its contents, and proceed with her day. Frederick would collect it before anyone else noticed it. Nothing would change. Her position would remain secure. Her £38 a year and the roof above her, and the fire in the small bedroom at the back of the second floor. She set the letter on the salver. She went to the window and looked down at Cavendish Square for a full 3 minutes, watching a pair of pigeons negotiate a crust of bread, and then she went back to the salver and took the letter to Lady Darvell. Lady Darvell read it twice, very quietly, and then folded it and held it in both hands, as though deciding what it weighed. She asked Thea to leave her alone for an hour. When Thea returned, Lady Darvell's face had settled into a kind of grief that was not fresh, but had been waiting there for a long time, recognizing itself. Frederick found out within 2 days. He came to Thea's room on a Tuesday morning, his face arranged into a careful pleasantness that was the most frightening thing she had yet seen him produce, and he told her that her services were no longer required, effective at the end of the week. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply explained, in a voice of perfect courtesy, that his mother's health required a different kind of attendance going forward, one that Thea was not suited to provide, and that he would not be furnishing a character reference, as her conduct had not merited one. Without the reference, she could not be engaged by any respectable household. Every agency would ask, and when they asked, the absence of it would speak louder than any explanation she offered. Thea thanked him politely and closed the door. What she did not know was that she had already been seen. 3 days before Frederick delivered his verdict, the Duke of Aldeborn had come to Cavendish Square on a matter of his own business with Lady Darvell, something concerning a charitable subscription they both supported. He had been shown to the library to wait. The library shared a wall with Lady Darvell's sitting room, and its door, which the footman had not fully latched, stood a quarter open to the corridor that led past the sitting room's entrance. He had not intended to witness anything. He had been standing at the shelf that held the volume. He was idly considering a Bacon, which he had no real intention of reading, but held in his hand as something to do with himself while he waited, when he heard Thea's voice. She was speaking to someone, and at first he could not identify the quality of the exchange. Her voice was low and even. Then he heard Frederick's raised with a precision that was worse than shouting. And then the door to the corridor swung half open, and he saw her standing in the passage. She was still. Not the stillness of fear. Though fear was there, he could see it in the held line of her shoulders. It was the stillness of someone who has already made their decision and is simply waiting for the other person to finish speaking, so that she can proceed with it. Frederick was telling her what her future would look like without his endorsement. He was being very thorough about it. And she was listening with an attention so complete and so unmoved that the Duke found he had forgotten the bacon. Entirely, Frederick left. She stood alone in the passage for a moment, and the Duke watched her face do something small and private, a brief contraction around the eyes, a single steadied breath, and then compose itself. She turned and walked back toward the stairs with the same measured step she always used, as though the corridor were exactly as it should be, and she had no quarrel with it. He replaced the bacon on the shelf. He found he was thinking about the particular quality of her stillness for the rest of the afternoon, and could not entirely account for why. He could account for some of it, if he was honest with himself, which he rarely was on the subject. He had first noticed her at the ball 3 weeks ago, which had surprised him, because he did not generally notice companions at balls. He noticed the women he was supposed to notice. He did his duty by the season, appeared at the required events, deflected the Dowager Honoria's increasingly direct suggestions about Miss Cecily Rawdon, and went home. He had been doing this for 2 years. 2 years since Catherine. He did not think her name, if he could avoid it. The portrait in his study at Aldeborn had been turned to face the wall the week after the funeral, and he had not corrected this. She had been 21 years old, and she had wanted a child more than she had been willing to say. And he had agreed to it, when the physician's counsel had been cautious but not prohibitive, and she had died in February of the following year, along with the child, in a stillness so complete it had seemed impossible that a room could hold it. He had been cold ever since, with a precision that he recognized was discipline and that served him adequately in most situations. It did not serve him, it appeared, in the matter of a woman in a gray gown who made costly decisions, quietly in empty corridors. He told himself it was admiration of a general kind, a quality of character that anyone might respect. He was not, he told himself, constitutionally suited to anything further. If you have found yourself leaning forward in your chair, know that you are not alone in this, and that the story has only just begun its work. Stay close. Honoria Vane, the Dowager Duchess of Aldeborn, had been the dominant figure of the season for 11 years running, and she held that position with the focused expertise of someone who understood that social authority is a structure requiring daily maintenance. She had identified Miss Cecily Rawdon in November of the previous year, had approved her breeding, her fortune, her family connections, and her pleasant, untroubling beauty, and had arranged her at the Duke's dinner table twice, and at his cousin's house party once before the season had properly opened. She was not cruel. She was efficient. She noticed Thea first at the morning call in the third week, when Thea accompanied Lady Darvell to the Dowager's Grosvenor Street house, and sat with the companions and the other attendants in the outer drawing-room while the ladies conducted their conversation inside. Honoria passed through the outer room on her way to the bell-pull and saw Thea reading, not simply passing the time with a periodical. Reading with the quality of attention one usually associated with scholars rather than companion. "Who was that girl?" she asked her maid afterward. "Miss Foss." "My lady. Lady Darvell's companion. Her father was a gentleman of some kind in Somerset, I believe, but he left her nothing." Honoria filed this. She said nothing then. She waited, as she always waited, for the information to become useful. It became useful at Vauxhall, in the 5th week of the season. The pleasure gardens were loud that evening with lanterns and music and the particular gaiety that arises when polished people find themselves in an outdoor space and decide to conduct their social performances at a slightly higher volume than usual. Thea was present because Lady Darvell had insisted on attending and required her arm. They had been there 20 minutes when she heard it. Honoria was 3 supper boxes away, her voice not raised but carrying, as voices trained in drawing rooms carry through any space, with a clarity that does not require effort. Lady Darvell's companion? Yes, I believe I know of her. Miss Voss. Very presentable. Quite earnest, but quite without connections of any kind. Rather provincial in her manners. One does feel for these girls who find themselves so entirely without prospects, but one cannot pretend they are something they are not. The words reached Thea as a kind of weather, arriving from a direction she had not been watching. She kept her face still. She was practiced at keeping her face still. Lady Darvell had not heard, or had chosen not to. She was examining the lamp arrangement with appreciation. Thea looked at the supper box and saw Cecily Rawdon seated at Honoria's hand, fair and untroubled and certain of her appointment in the world. And she understood then with a clarity she would have preferred to avoid that the Dowager was not simply placing a label on her out of carelessness. The label was being affixed with care, in front of witnesses, for a reason. Lady Darvell died on a Thursday morning in late May, in her room at Cavendish Square, with Thea at her bedside, and Frederick standing at the window. She went quietly, with the same patient restraint she had brought to her illness for 2 years. She was buried 6 days later at the family church in Hertfordshire. Thea attended the funeral. She returned to London on the Saturday and spent the following 3 days in the small back bedroom packing her trunk, composing herself, and calculating. £38 was her full wage, paid in quarterly installments, and she had been dismissed before the quarter's end, which meant the final installment had not been paid. which meant she had £11 and some odd shillings to her name, and no reference letter and no prospect of one. She had written to 2 agencies. Both had replied within the week. Both had asked for her character reference. When she explained that her previous employer's representative was not in a position to provide one, both agencies had, with regret, been unable to assist her further. She was composing the 3rd letter to a household in Edinburgh that had placed an advertisement and might not yet have had the opportunity to ask for references when Frederick appeared at her door again. He brought with him this time a younger man she did not recognize, who was introduced as Mr. Rawdon, brother of Miss Cecily Rawdon, and who had the look of someone conducting a transaction he considered straightforward. Mr. Sebelier. Rawdon made his proposal in terms he evidently considered generous. He had rooms in Jermyn Street. He admired her considerably. He could be of material assistance, especially given her current circumstances, and he believed they could arrive at an arrangement mutually beneficial. He used the word arrangement 3 times. He did not use the word marriage once. Thea put down her pen. She looked at Mr. Doe, Rawdon for a moment, and at Frederick standing in the doorway behind him, and she understood that this had been arranged, that it was meant to be Frederick's clean solution to the problem of her continued presence in his house while it was being settled, and that both men considered her current circumstances persuasive enough to make the answer obvious. "I must ask you to leave my room," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. Frederick's expression shifted just briefly, and she saw the contempt he usually kept below the surface. "You are not in a position to be particular, Miss Voss," he said. "Then I will be particular from a position of some inconvenience," she said. "I must ask you to leave." They left. She sat for a long time afterward with her hands in her lap, and the unfinished letter to Edinburgh on the desk in front of her, and she allowed herself, in the privacy of that small room, to feel the weight of what she was facing without the performance of steadiness. £11 and no reference, no family, no connections. The dowager's voice from Vauxhall finding her again in the quiet. Quite without prospects. That was when she wrote to the Duke. She did not know what she was writing entirely. She knew it was not a request for a position, because she could not ask that. She knew it was not a declaration of anything because she had no right to declare anything. She had spoken to him perhaps 4 times in total. Brief exchanges at the edge of rooms, once in the library corridor, when he had come to call on Lady Darville, where he had asked a question about the book she was carrying, Cowper's Letters, and listened to her answer with the quality of attention she associated with people who actually wanted to know. She wrote him the truth. She wrote that she had taken an action she believed to be right, that the action had cost her her position and her reference, and therefore her ability to earn her living, and that she was not asking him to remedy this, but wished him to know the reason for it, because he had seemed to her on the occasions of their brief acquaintance to be a man who valued accurate information about the world. She wrote that she intended to leave London within the fortnight and attempt to find a situation through her own resources. She wrote that she was glad to have known him, however. Slightly, she sealed it and gave it to the housekeeper's girl to post. She was quite certain it would produce nothing. She was 22 years old, and she had read enough of the world to know that a duke receiving a letter of this kind from a woman in her position had no obligation to do anything with it except file it among the documents of the season and forget it by August. She expected nothing. She had packed 3/4 of her trunk. She was ready to go. She was not ready for what happened at the garden party. The garden party at Aldeborne House in the 2nd week of June was the season's late effort, the social occasion that gathered up the stragglers and the undecided before everyone dispersed to the country. Honoria had arranged it. Thea received an invitation that she knew, the moment she held it, was not meant for her. It had been addressed to Lady Darville. The housekeeper's girl, finding it among the post with no other direction, had brought it to Thea as the only remaining member of the household capable of making a decision about it. She went. She could not have said afterward what made her go, except that she was a woman who believed in acting from her values rather than from the expectation of favorable outcomes, and her values told her that declining to appear at the one place where the truth of what had happened might have any witnesses was a form of cowardice she could not afford to practice. She wore the dark blue gown, which was the better of her two, though the lace at the hem had been retrimmed twice, and the seam at the left shoulder had been repaired with thread that was not quite the right weight. She arrived at Aldeborn House alone. She was shown into the garden, which was long and well kept and filled with the kind of people who occupied the season's highest tables, and she stood at the edge of it for a moment calculating where the least visible position was, and then she heard Honoria's voice, behind her. "Miss Voss?" The dowager's tone was not unkind. It was the tone one used for creatures that had wandered into the wrong field. "I wonder if you have confused the invitation. This is a private occasion." She was not speaking quietly. There were people nearby, a cluster of them by the rose beds, and several had turned their heads. "Lady Darvel was invited," Thea said. "I am attending in her memory." "Lady Darvel is dead," Honoria said, with a precision that sealed the sentence on both sides. "And you are, I believe, between situations, Miss Voss. These gatherings are not quite suitable for a woman in your present position. I say this with genuine concern for your comfort." There it was. The third voicing, in front of witnesses, at the last moment, it could do the most work. Thea felt the particular heat of public reduction spreading across her shoulders, and she kept her chin level, and she did not move. She heard the murmuring from the rosebeds. She heard the orchestra pause between pieces. And then she heard footsteps on the grass. Not the careful, measured steps of the assembled guests making a tactical retreat. These were direct, deliberate, and covered the distance from the far end of the garden in a pace that suggested the person making them had identified where they were going some time before they began walking. Edmund Ashcroft crossed the lawn. He was wearing dark gray, no decorative nonsense, and he moved through the assembled guests the way weather moves through a room when a window opens, and people turned and then turned again to follow the direction of his trajectory. Cecily Rawdon's fan stopped moving in her hand. Honoria's expression, which had been in perfect command, underwent a brief technical difficulty. He stopped beside Thea. He did not look at Honoria first. He looked at Thea with that flat, measuring attention that she had spent 8 weeks deciding was general and indifferent, and she found that it was neither of those things. Up close, in the full afternoon light, his face held something beneath the discipline, a quality of careful attention that was the opposite of indifference, that had, in fact, all the signs of having been present for a very long time. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was quiet. He did not raise it. He did not need to. "Your Grace," she said, "I received your letter." He paused, and the pause was the kind that holds weight rather than avoiding it. "You wrote that you were glad to have known me, however slightly. I find I cannot accept, however slightly is the proper measure of the matter." The garden was entirely still. Honoria produced a single flat "Your Grace," with the tone of someone attempting to reassert the grammar of the situation. And he looked at her then, briefly, with a courtesy so complete it was its own kind of answer. "Lady Honoria," he said, "I believe Mr. Pell has been waiting for some time in the east drawing-room. He has brought the formal instrument. I would be grateful if you would send for him." Honoria's fan stilled. She understood in one clause of her own interior that she had miscalculated the timeline, that the Duke had moved faster than the season's machinery expected its principals to move, and that the instrument Pell had brought was not a matter. She could intercept. She said nothing further. She moved away from the rose beds with the controlled composure of a woman who intends to regroup before she concedes anything, and several of the guests parted for her automatically, though their eyes remained where she had left them. Edmund turned back to Thea. Something had shifted in his face. Some precise arrangement of restraint had moved a fraction, the way ice moves on a river in early March, when the current has finally found purchase beneath it. "I should have written first," he said. "I did not know how to write it. I knew how to come here." Thea looked at him, this careful, cold, grieving man. who had walked the length of a garden in front of the entire assembled hierarchy of the London season, to stand beside her, and she felt something that was not triumph or relief, but was older and quieter than either of those things. The specific warmth of being seen accurately by someone who had looked with care. "I did not expect this," she said. "No," he said. "I know. I am sorry it took me so long to be clear." He did not offer her his hand yet. Not here. Not with the situation still requiring its procedural confirmation. "Will you come inside? Mr. Pell needs to confirm the forms. And I would like, once the forms are done, to introduce you to my housekeeper. At Aldeborn, she has been waiting longer than either of us for someone to fill that particular position." It was the closest thing to a declaration that his register would permit in a garden full of witnesses. And it was precise and irrevocable and meant every word. And Thea understood it as clearly as she understood anything she had ever read. Mr. Pell was waiting in the east drawing room, a small, careful man with excellent handwriting and the solicitor's useful talent for appearing to have heard nothing of whatever had just occurred on the lawn. He confirmed the formal instrument of betrothal, checked the pertinent details, and signed in the appropriate places. The Duke confirmed. Thea signed with a steadiness that came from the same place her steadiness always came from, not the absence of feeling, but the decision to act despite its full presence. Cecily Rawdon had left with her brother before the east drawing room door had opened. Thea did not learn this until afterward, and when she learned it she felt only a mild and genuine sympathy for a young woman who had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice, and had discovered in a single afternoon that the correction had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with the specific blindness of the people who had. By arranging her, Honoria had remained in the garden until the guests departed. Thea was told she had said very little for the rest of the afternoon, and had twice been seen to look toward the house with an expression that suggested a person confronting the limits of a system she had entirely trusted. She was not humiliated. She was corrected. The distinction, Thea thought, mattered. December came to Aldeborn, the way December comes to Wiltshire from the north, and with intention, settling over the estate's long fields in a silence that was different from London's silence, broader and less effortful. Thea had been in the house 4 months now, and she knew its rooms in the way one knows a place. When one has been paying attention, the cold corridor outside the East Gallery, where the draft came in no matter how the windows were sealed, the particular creak of the third stair from the bottom, the way the kitchen garden looked in the late afternoon light, stripped of everything except its bare brown rose. She had not yet been into the study. She had been near it, had stood at its threshold on 2 occasions, had looked through the open door and seen the desk and the 2 chairs and the shelf of volumes and the fireplace and the blank backing of a large frame on the wall to the left of the window, facing away from the room. Edmund was there on the morning of the first snowfall. She found him standing in front of the turned portrait. He did not hear her come in, or, if he heard her, he did not move. She stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the line of his back, that familiar quality of contained attention, and waited. "She was 21, he said without turning. His voice had the quality of something that had been prepared for a long time and was only now being delivered. The physician said the risk was manageable. I agreed with her that we should proceed. I have spent 2 years constructing a verdict from that agreement." Thea walked the length of the room and stood beside him. The portrait faced away from them both, its backing plain wood, and she looked at it for a moment, and then looked at his face, at the grief that was there in the precise, disciplined way he carried everything, not softened, but present. "What was her name?" she asked. "Catherine." She said nothing for a moment. "Then, may I see her?" He was still for a long time. Then he reached out and turned the portrait. Catherine Ashcroft had been dark-haired and slight, with a quality in her painted expression that suggested she had been amused by something the painter had said and had not quite finished being amused when he had resumed his work. She was beautiful in the specific way of a person whose character has arranged their features. And she looked, Thea thought, like someone who had loved the world with confidence and expected it to continue deserving that confidence. "She would have hated me standing here, deciding she was a verdict," Edmund said. "Yes," Thea said. "I think she would have," he exhaled. It was a brief thing, almost inaudible, but it was the first completely unguarded breath she had heard him take, and it was the sound of something that had been held a very long time, finally being set down. Outside the study window, the snow was falling across the Aldebourne fields, laying itself over the brown December rose in the slow, patient way of something that intends to stay. Inside, the fire was burning in the grate. Thea was standing beside Edmund Ashcroft in his study, in front of the portrait of his first wife, which had been faced away from the room for 2 years and was now facing it again. He turned to her. He said her name. Not Miss Foss, not the formal address, not the careful, measured syllables of a man keeping a distance. Her name. Thomasina. He said it the way one says a word that has been in the back of one's throat for a long time, that one has been carrying since before one knew one was carrying it, a word that answers a question the mouth did not know it was asking. She thought, "This is what it is to be heard." She thought, "I will remember the exact quality of the light in this room, the snow at the window, the fire, his face saying my name as though it were the first and final thing he was certain of." By Christmas she had learned that the estate's housekeeper, Mrs. Cole, had been corresponding with Edmund about the matter of her welfare since November, when he had apparently consulted Mrs. B. Cole's opinion, and been informed, in the housekeeper's useful and economical way, that Miss Foss was exactly what Aldebourne had been missing, and that the Duke ought to get on with it. Mrs. Cole told Thea this herself, with the direct satisfaction of a woman whose advice has been acted upon over tea in the house kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while the snow continued outside, and the fire did its work. Thea laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded and warm, the kind that arrives unexpectedly after a long time of having nothing ready for it, and Mrs. Cole looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting for precisely that sound. She thought as she walked back through the house to the study, through the cold east corridor, and past the third stairs familiar creak, that she had come into this world with 40 pounds in a trunk of books, and had spent 2 years learning to be invisible, and that she had never, in all of that learning, become invisible to the person whose seeing had finally turned out to matter. His name was Edmund. He was 34 years old, and cold in the precise way of someone who had been disciplined by grief into a kind of patience, and he was upstairs in his study with the portrait of Catherine facing the room, and she was bringing him the list of the tenants' winter concerns that Mrs. Cole had pressed into her hand on her way out of the kitchen, and when she opened the door he would look up and say her name, and she would feel it again, that particular warmth, the specific undeniable warmth of being seen truly. The snow kept falling on the Aldebourne fields. The candle on the study desk burned. Somewhere in the west wing, a door had been left open, and the draft from it moved through the upstairs corridors with a familiar soft persistence. And none of it, none of the cold or the gray December quiet or the long plain rows of the kitchen garden under its covering of white, none of it felt like the world she had been enduring. It felt like the one she had come home to. If Thea's story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you longest. And if you would like to return to this house and these characters, the way one returns to a warm room after a long time outside, please do stay close.